Rest is Silence. Can I ask those who are sitting right at the back to please come up forward? Please, can you come up front for this session if you're staying? Javed Jabbar Sahab, are you coming for this session? Are you escaping? As usual? All right, leave your hostage behind, please. Thank you. Volunteers, can you close that middle door, please, so we can get the session going? Thank you. Welcome. I'd like to just quickly introduce our moderator for this session, Ms. Niilofer Farrukh, who will then introduce her panelists. Niilofer, over to you.
Thank you, Samuel. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for coming on a Friday when things in the afternoon are very kind of uncertain, because of the long prayer break and lunch. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this session on The Rest is Silence. This is a book on Zahoor Akhlaq, as you all know, a very influential artist on the contemporary art scene. In fact, if we look at the art history of Pakistan, even the last 60 plus years, he is a towering figure, no doubt. It was about 15 years ago that Zahoor and his daughter were murdered. And I think some of you already have the details of this very tragic end of the artist. And after his death, which took place in the apartment, it was locked up. And then many years later, it was opened by the wife, who then started the conservation project on Zahoor's studio and the archives. And this is when Roger Connah, who has written this book, was introduced to Zahoor. And that is the reason for his preoccupation with Zahoor's death throughout the book. That is the prism through which he looks at Zahoor's life, his art, and the society in which he developed his career. So we who are friends of Zahoor, and I'll be introducing the panel to you, obviously look at Zahoor as that lively, gentle, creative spirit. But Roger Connah takes another take on it, which is what we find in The Rest is Silence. It is, of course, his book, and he calls it an experiment in biography. That means he's not looking at it as a conventional biography, but is piercing together fragments from what he found in the archives and the facts that come to light during those countless interviews, really on 3 continents, that he conducted with Zahoor's friends. So he doesn't claim it to be a factual narrative, but a narrative that is, sort of vague, it's random, and we will talk about it. And on the first page of the book, Roger claims that the book is critical fiction and goes on to elaborate the artist in this book does not exist. But the artist, Zahoor Akhlaq, father, lover, teacher, Muslim, pacifist, modernist, and postmodernist, non-terrorist, did exist, and was tragically murdered on 18th January 1999. With this statement, the author challenges the myth created around Zahoor. And this is really the premise of the book, that there is a myth, there's something that he's put together, and then in a very kind of nebulous style, he weaves the story. And truth and fiction are navigated through this sort of stylistic, but in a very distinct kind of stylistic writing. The book is not an easy read, as our panelists will also share with you. All 365 pages challenge the patience of the reader. Throughout, you have passages that take you somewhere and then leave you without any conclusion. I mean, this sort of is a pattern in the book. And then we will talk about that also with the panelists. But in the end, the reader is rewarded with many insights, which we as insiders to the country and the professional circle are often blinded to, because we just don't have the objective distance. Rest is Silence is by no means a definitive book on Zahoor, but it's a book that asks many important questions. And to discuss the book and address some of the questions, we have with us a very distinguished panel. Let me start with Zohra Husain. Zohra Husain's name is not new to you. She is the founder, director of Chowkhandi Art Gallery, a very prestigious space in Karachi, and has exhibited artists from all over the world, as well as, of course, Pakistan, all other cities of Pakistan. She is an important figure on the national art scene, and in the 90s, she played a very important role in promoting Zahoor through a series of exhibitions. And she's going to tell us about that. She also had the opportunity to observe Zahoor interact with critics and the audience very closely. And this is an information that all of us are not privy to, because Zahoor spent a lot of time in the gallery and she saw that interaction. Our other panelist is Saquib Hanif. Saquib is a respected voice in critical art writing in Pakistan, and we all wish he would write more often. And whenever I do get an opportunity, I do sort of try and rope him in. And I'm very grateful that he has taken out time from his full-day job to be here. He's the former editor of Herald. And in 2009, you might have seen his series Framed, which he did for Dawn Television. He did these 20 art series, episodes, in which conversations with artists brought quite often new dimensions to light. And these series were conceptualized and conducted by Saquib. Our third panelist is Shahana Rajani. She's a young critic and a curator. She holds a BA in History of Art from the University of Cambridge. After that degree, she came back and served as the curator of the gallery at the Karachi School of Art for several years. And then she went back to complete her master's in History of Art and in curatorial studies at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Presently, she's the visiting lecturer at Visual Studies Department at the Karachi University. I'd just like to tell the audience that after our discussion with the panelists, we are also, if we have time, hopefully, we will also be, inviting some questions. So if you do have them, hopefully, we'll get a chance to sort of do that. Let me start with Shahana. Shahana, as a member of a generation that knows Zahoor mainly through his art and his writing, what were your expectations with this first book on Zahoor, who is really a towering figure, his pedagogic contribution, and his art has inspired a new way of seeing and imagining in Pakistani art. So, what were you expecting from the book?
Of course, people from my generation, we haven't had the pleasure of maybe knowing Zahoor personally, but more and more so in the past decade, he's being increasingly credited as this towering pioneering figure who made space, the intellectual and conceptual space for the future generation of neo-miniature painters. And, for instance, the Rashid Rana show in Mohata does credit Zahoor as the main influence for the artist. So going into the book, I was really hoping to, get to know more about how the sort of pioneering artist, what the work is that he did, and how we've come to remember him in the way that we do. But of course, as you briefly mentioned in your introduction, the book is not a critical evaluation of his art practice, and it is not a conventional biography. What Roger Connah has set out to do is he seems to be deconstructing the persona and the myth of the artist. So his entire book, he is refusing to give the reader that vantage point of knowing everything that we're so accustomed to have. It's a very destabilizing and fragmentary narrative that we get. Not so much, we get information not so much about his art production, but the social relations that he had, the society that he was part of, his varying multiple personalities. The book really does consist of first-hand interviews that he's taken from people who knew Zahoor, either knew him really well or even people who just met him once and, their remembrances. So his collection of interviews, when it comes together, really shows us the selective process, the process of selective memory, and what critical fictions have come into being for us to know Zahoor the way that we do now. So that's something that I found interesting about the book. Initially, it's incredibly frustrating to not get that coherent chronology of events or, what he did from graduating from college and then onwards till his death. But ultimately, you begin to revel in these small tidbits and pieces of information and gossip and rumor and scandal that the author gives you about the artist.
Thank you, Shahana. As Shahana mentioned, there is a kind of... the narrative is destabilizing. And what I'd like to ask Saquib, who's, our other panelist, is that the book has a fragmented format and this nebulous narrative style. Do you think it's a deliberate strategy to capture what Roger calls in his book the constant and consistent illegibility of Zahoor's life and art practice? This restlessness of the artist is mentioned time and again throughout the book. Roger mentions how the artist was always inviting within his art an unfinished zone, a space where the random might define the serious. How do you look at this stylistic approach? Do you think it is a deliberate strategy?
Well, I think that's the interesting aspect of the book. I mean, almost throughout the book, you get an echo of Zahoor's personality. The lack of closure, the vagabond nature, more questions than answers, although all great art just asks questions, never gives answers. But I think there is a fluctuating, destabilizing element which was very much part of Zahoor's work and his personality as well. I mean, for those of us who may have met him during his shows or outside of that, whenever asked about his work, he really had mumblings to rattle off. And I think that was part of the charm. He refused to speak on his work. He left it very vague. And this whole, sort of vagabond nature of the narrative that Roger Connah is sort of almost curating, I do feel has some relevance to Zahoor's own persona. So I think it's a deliberate device on his part. There are no comings and goings. It's almost sort of unhinged, the narrative. And I think that is very much part of Zahoor's work.
And can you also elaborate on how he's formatted the book? Not only stylistically does he adopt this, what you've just said, but also the formatting of the book is such, you have these short sort of chapters, and the book is entirely divided into 3. How do you look at that? Does it make easy reading? Does it make difficult reading?
Well, I think it's not a linear narrative. And I think that's what makes the reading a little cumbersome. It makes the reading more interesting in the sense that, at least for someone like myself, who's seen and interacted with Zahoor, one does get a feeling of almost reliving his personality. And Yet I feel that the book, while being divided into chapters, really lacks connectivity. And I think that's deliberate. Zahoor's work, Zahoor's persona, and the way he worked, I think there was, lack of ostensible connections. I think this is an important element that comes through the book.
Thank you. I think, Zohra Appa, you spent a lot of time, I think, on the panel here. I think you spent probably the most amount of time with Zahoor. And, as one reads the book, one sees how Roger discusses Zahoor. I mean, he speaks of Zahoor as a serious innovator and an intelligent artist, but someone seriously seeking validation. That seems to be a concern that Roger articulates all the time, that while Zahoor was this giant, figure, but yet he had this insecurity in which he was very unsure about his own talent. And because of that, he went into this kind of self-destructive behavior. And he neglected his health, his alcoholic consumption increased, and obviously, by the late 90s, he was quite unwell. So, also, he connects this with what Akbar Naqvi wrote on him, his brutal attack on Zahoor, his brutal critique on Zahoor in his book Image and Identity. And Roger continues to talk about it and in many ways attacks Akbar Naqvi for this critique. So do you remember times when, you had seen a Zahoor that felt this need for validation?
Well, what I feel is that he's written a very, very well-researched book. And when you read it, you can't help
Can you speak at the mic, Zohra?
You can't help admiring the research that has gone into it. I mean, being a non-Muslim, he's studied Muslim traditions. He's gone into Sufism. He had architecture, and he's tried to meet all his friends. And I mean, he had a very difficult task of reconstructing the artist when he had never met him. And all he had was few pieces of paper, decaying papers, few writings, and some paintings and the little objects that he had left behind. So the task was very difficult. But still, I mean, the way he writes the book, in a way he justifies, because he feels that it suits Zahoor's personality. The way he's written in fragmentation, and the beginning and the end is all there. But I feel if he had written, I mean, he says Zahoor had a very mysterious personality. He was very elusive, and it's not easy writing about him. But he had these aspects of his personality. But still, if he had written a consistent book, and the way books are written, I think it would have made things easy. That's what I feel. Because after reading 50, 60 pages, I just threw up my hands and I said, if Niilofer holds a gun to my head, I'm not going to read it, But after some time, very dutifully, I went through it. And when I went through it, I did realize that he had made a lot of effort. And a book of such magnitude will not be written for a very long time to come. Such research. Though I suppose it will always be flawed because he was non-Muslim. And, But what he writes about Zahoor, in a way, in the beginning I didn't find such turbulence in his personality or disturbance. He was quite a relaxed person. He smiled very easily. He joked. And it's only when he came back from Canada that I found him very, very disturbed. He was very disturbed because I believe he was a nobody in Canada. And here he was the painter's painter, the artist's artist, and he had hundreds and thousands of students who admired him. He even got an award for being the most brilliant art teacher. And I'm sure Zahoor, with intelligence, he could see how he was sort of influencing the art, the direction that Pakistani art was taking. And he could see, and I believe he could visualize that generations of students coming up will all be working the way he did, And very few people understood his work. But after he had his first exhibition with me in 1986, and I think we sort of marketed him as much as we can, and by 87, he was a very selling artist. And I don't remember sending back any of his canvases, though they were very grey with very little imagery. And I remember some remarks that, is there a painting on that canvas? Is it something? Does it say something? But he started selling. And when he had his exhibition in Ziggurat in 1991, am I speaking too much or shall I go on?
No, please go on.
So in 1991, when he had his exhibition at Ziggurat, I was a little upset and I said, Zahoor, are you dissatisfied with the sale? Or are you having it at another gallery? And he said, no, I'm not dissatisfied with the sale. And I feel I always have some money in my pocket these days. He speak very little, but he said it, I always have money in my pocket, I'm quite happy. But my in-laws have very good relationship with the Kawasjis, and beside your gallery is small. And I said, I'm going to buy a big gallery, which I did, large gallery. And within 6 months, he gave me another exhibition, which means that he was very encouraged, he was working very well, he was quite happy and very prolific. And that's why he was, 2 exhibitions within a year was quite a lot, And the second, the exhibition at Ziggurat went well, like my exhibition again, 1991 went well. Then 1993, he came back from Bilkent University, gave me another exhibition, which also went well. And then if he was sad, probably he was sad about, some people expect a lot from themselves. Perhaps he could not, in his work, achieve what he really wanted to achieve. And that might have led to this melancholy and impotence, what the writer writes about. It's not because he was not appreciated, wherever he went, he was welcome. But coming back from Canada, I thought he was in a pathetic state. He was a very sad person, maybe because of the neglect that he went through in Canada. And that is when I noticed the change in him.
Thank you for this insight, Zohra Appa, because I think this dimension of his life is not really documented as it should be, because if you go through the book, The Rest is Silence, what bothers you throughout the book is the negativity. In the discussion of his life, his personality, and even, his relationship with others, there is this kind of a larger dwelling on the negative aspect. So I think it's very encouraging to hear that Zahoor did have his happy moments. My last question to all the panelists would be, what kind of readership do you expect this book to have? Because it is about an artist and not really a biography. It is a challenging book to read. So I think, Shahana.
I think the fact that it's not academic sort of evaluation of his work gives it a wider audience, that you don't need to be an art historian or an art academic to have access to the book. He sort of, as we've been discussing, he's constantly refusing the author to gloss over the complexities and contradictions of Zahoor's life. You get a lot of glimpses into his different multiple personalities, into his different social relations, the different spheres he traveled in, the different places he visited. And these kind of anecdotal tidbits actually, I think, really make the book, in some places, very accessible for the youth, at the very least.
Zohra Appa?
I think on the whole, the book suffers from over-analysis and sort of intellectualizing everything that Zahoor did, and analyzes too much and makes a lot of references to philosophers, writers, literary figures of Europe. which we are not familiar with. That's what confuses us really. But when he makes a reference to the Conference of the Bird, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, we are very comfortable and very happy. I think it's the references that he gives, and the audience here are really not sort of familiar with these words. And besides, I do think when a person writes a book, he should think, what audience he's aiming at. And I think the audience he had in mind were probably sort of the likes of Professor Salima Hashmi or Suleri or people like that, but not ordinary readers,
Saquib, what would your observation be?
Well, it is, very cumbersome to read. And I wonder how much the references lend credence to what he is saying. I think it's over-referenced. And there are certain biases that are dominant throughout the book, which perhaps, at least from me, takes away from the value. Because if you look at it art historically, I think it's a very interesting document because it's a new way of looking at art. And as assemblage of anecdotes, interviews, personality traits that come through, at certain moments in one's life, I think that way it's very interesting. I started the book and I hated it. And ultimately, I think there was something to be gained by reading it. I was glad I read it. I wouldn't have ever done it had Niilofer never asked me. But I'm glad I did because I think it gives you a completely different prism to look at art. And I think that's a positive contribution.
I agree because I think almost all of us on the panel started reading the book and found it cumbersome. I think this is something we share. But we also share that, after having finished the book, we did get a lot of insight into his character. And as Saquib said, this particular way of writing, it added, it sort of showed us that, a narrative can be written in this way that mirrors a particular character that it is based on. So before I invite questions from the audience, I would like to say that Roger Connah invites us to take this book as a research treatise on an artist called Zahoor Akhlaq and a travel book where blindness, ignorance and knowledge are a part of the journey experienced. I hope we've interested you in sort of whetted your appetite to read this book because I think in the end the poetics of the unrest will interest you. Thank you for coming, and I think we're almost up, our time is up, but maybe we can take one or two questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah. I think we are 4 o'clock. Yeah. Romana, it's...
Niilofer, can I...
Okay.
Sorry, can I just say that this session is for a full hour?
Sorry?
It is an hour because the one that was sharing with you has dropped out, so you have...
Okay, all the better.
Please
We can continue the conversation with the participation of the audience.
If I remember correctly, when you started, you said...
Can you...
you had mentioned that the author did not know Mr. Zahoor Akhlaq, and he...
Sorry, can you speak a little louder?
He had not met him until he started writing the book.
Right.
I wanted to know what made him write the book, and what is the author's connection with the artist, and what is the author's background? Is he an art historian or just an autobiographist? Do we know anything about the author?
I think there's several, things that, sort of can be said. One of them is that, as I mentioned, that Roger Connah met Scheherazade in Scandinavia. This was after Zahoor's death. And she mentioned to him, Zahoor's life, and they got discussing things. And then when she started her conservation project, the restoration of the studio, his personal archives, she invited him or commissioned him to be a part of that team. And that is when Roger really decided during that period when he was working in the studio, and he saw fragments of, old papers, Zahoor's own work, that sparked his interest. And he found this personality, this very enigmatic personality, something that he wanted to sort of learn more about. And I think that was the time when he decided on the book, and then went on to interview a lot of people. As Zohra mentioned, it has been thoroughly researched. He traveled extensively in Pakistan. He traveled in North America, in Europe, particularly England, and he gathered information and then sort of put this book together. So basically, he never knew Zahoor, and I met him and we did a short interview. He was a very conscientious researcher. That is something I noticed. And I think also he enjoyed the distance he had. He did not know Zahoor personally. There was no emotional link with Zahoor. And I think he enjoyed that in a way. He took a position. Well, obviously, when he began to write the book, we do see that, a lot of it does get influenced by his opinion or what he thought was the life that Zahoor was leading and his experiences. But at the point when he's interviewing people, he had that. Zohra, did you meet Roger Connah? Did he come and talk to you?
No, he didn't come talk to me, and I'm glad in a way he didn't, because I would have given him so much information that there would have been another tedious chapter to the book.
Quite right. We would have maybe known another side of Zahoor. So, but I think, and Roger's own profession, he actually has been a film critic. He divides his time between Finland and Wales. He's been a film critic. He runs a retreat. He's a researcher. When I talked to him, he emphasized that his basic interest is research. So he sort of saddles film, visual arts, and, fields of that sort. So, I think that's where he's coming from. Any other questions?
I asked Zohra a question, since there are no hands in the audience. I was wondering, since you have worked so closely with Zahoor Saab, at the time when he first started showing his work, I understand that his contemporary artists were sort of involved in more traditional Western models such as Cubism, Expressionism, etc. So when Zahoor Saab started showing his work, could you give us some details about how people, the public, received the work, what they thought of it, how different it really was?
Actually,
or not?
When he first had the exhibition, and he brought few drawings, he brought 2 Farman series, and there were 2 lovely, landscapes of Punjab, which he did in rectangles, and there was the Nawabpur incidents, and just a few pieces that he brought.
Right.
And of all the preparations I made, and the total sale was 4 pieces of work, which amounted to 16,000 rupees. I mean, that's what it is. And everybody came and congratulated me because they said Zahoor had never made a sale like that. And I think Zahoor was also very encouraged, because after that he continually assigned work to me, and I'm so glad that none of his, especially the canvases, never went back. I mean, he was constantly sending work to me, and I was selling the work. And I think, that's the first exhibition with 4 works sold was very encouraging for him.
Actually, I think we need to sort of acknowledge Mrs. Husain's role in bringing Zahoor to Karachi. I think it is an important aspect of Zahoor's currency in Karachi. And I think the kind of turnover that she saw in subsequent exhibitions of Zahoor is quite amazing for an artist who was complex at best and confusing at worst. It's a task and a half, I can imagine, but as she says, everything would sell. With artists in Pakistan, the tragedy is that the persona precedes the artist. The cachet precedes the artist. But even so, I think at a time when he was relatively unknown in Karachi,
That's right.
Yeah, Romana. Can we have the mic, Romana? No, please, because then the people at the back can hear you.
No, taking from what Shahana asked, Zohra Appa, you talked about the collectors, that is, or whoever, the pieces were sold, but if I have understood you correctly, did you want to ask what the artists were thinking about Zahoor, the artists, other artists?
His contemporaries.
What did they think about Zahoor's work at that time?
Actually, I think on the whole, the artists, they always said he's artists, and painters. And they were, I don't think in Karachi at that time there was any competition between the artists, and most of them really appreciated his work. And sort of, I think also because they realized he was not very sellable and very few people understood. And one reason being that he never explained his work. And you must have noticed throughout the book how the author complains about Akbar Naqvi. It becomes too much, It seems that he's refuting whatever Akbar Naqvi writes rather than writing an appreciation of Zahoor. So I think one reason being that Zahoor didn't give... I think Zahoor avoided unpleasantness. Any unpleasant situation he avoided. He would happily give a sort of a interview to Marjorie through other artists. And I remember the last interview he gave was to Shamim Akhtar. And if you read it, you'll be surprised how nicely he talked to her. And I'll reveal now to you that he wanted to write a book. He said, now I want to experiment with words. And we asked him, what sort of book you going to write? Stories? He said, no stories. I want to write about current affairs. I mean, this thing, nobody knows that he's wanted to write books about current affairs. And he said, I've already written a book on Shuftai. I've written a book on Shakir Ali. But he said, I've been so careless, I've lost all the pages. And I have a hard time collecting them,
I think Connah does talk about the writings of Zahoor, short notes that he found. And I think it is from those notes that he gleaned that he had an intellectual kind of perspective on things. Because, we must remember that we all knew Zahoor first through his art. But Connah discovered him bit by bit, fragment by fragment in that studio, where he looked at all that Zahoor was reading, all his short notes, whatever odd things he collected. Like he mentions that in Zahoor's books you could find unused traveler's checks. He squirreled money away because having had a very difficult, sort of childhood, he held on to money, and then of course he forgot all about it. And then he also, the way he kept certain things. So I think reading this book also informs you about another person's discovery of Zahoor. And I think that is important too. Because I think the entire panel, and I think many people in the audience knew him differently. Either they knew him at NCA, or they knew, I see Shanaz Ismail sitting here. She knew him at NCA. So, and probably, spent a lot of time with him there. And I see Sumayya Durrani sitting here, who was, I think, a student of Zahoor's, or maybe, at some point sort of interacted with him a lot. So, this is what this book is. It is through Roger's lens. We don't always agree with him, I must tell you that, because he's extremely critical of Pakistani society. And in that, I see a lot of colonial baggage. I do see a lens, and he kind of reinforces his position as a Westerner, writing on a society that he maybe has not lived. But then, from another perspective, sometimes we don't have the objective distance, and we tend to be blind to these problems. So I think these contradictions flow throughout the book. And, the more you read it, the more you also realize that he has this tremendous preoccupation with Zahoor's death. And he almost sort of blames. At times you feel that he's writing about a suicide rather than a murder. Because he tends to talk about conditions that were created in which Zahoor became self-destructive. He began to neglect his health. And yet, in the end, it was a bullet that sort of claimed his life rather than, other issues, other pressures that he felt. So I think there are many aspects that he leaves behind when sort of writing this critical fiction that he claims, the book is. Any other comments that you would like to make, Shahana? Any observations?
Just off of your comment on how the author comes with a lot of colonial baggage and he's very judgmental about Pakistani society. That's absolutely a constant thread in the book, but he is also quite upfront about this, which becomes strange for the reader because he begins the book, I think in the first few paragraphs of the book, he starts by saying, I'm coming from a place of ignorance, don't expect anything from me, I'll provide you no integrity, no knowledge, no nothing, and, take it as is, which is slightly presumptuous, very presumptuous actually, but that's something that he constantly brings up again and again, that, I am an outsider, and, this is just my view. And so I feel that sort of makes the reader more aware that this is his subjective viewpoint that's being provided.
No, but the thing is that the one thing there is about Roger is that while he is very judgmental on Pakistani society, on Muslim mindsets, on even Zahoor, I think what's important is that Roger is never ready to take responsibility for his own opinions.
Right.
Or, a particularly pejorative lens through which he's looking at these things. And I think that's a weakness. He lambastes Akbar Naqvi, almost purposefully throughout the text. And yet he wants to claim no, sort of liability for that. And I think that's a big difference between Dr. Naqvi and Roger Connah. Dr. Naqvi did have unpopular opinions, but he always stood athwart those opinions and fought it out. And I think Roger, in absolutely blowing him to smithereens, doesn't take any responsibility.
And don't you think he's sort of obsessed with certain personalities?
Zohra, can you speak in the mic, please?
Don't you think he's rather obsessed with some personalities in the book? Like, what was his name? Merton, Roger? Thomas Merton?
No.
Thomas Merton. And Barthes, the French philosopher, he goes on and on about them and comparing their deaths to Zahoor's death. Now, they died by accident. At least Thomas Merton got himself entangled in an electric fan and died by electrocution, while Zahoor was murdered deliberately by assassin's bullet. And I don't see the comparison. You can compare their works or their lives or some another way, and probably a death which, I think even that is fictional, that they carried a death wish. And you can compare that, but he goes on and on throughout the book, which sort of shows obsession.
I think there's another thing I felt while reading the book was that he privileges Zahoor's Muslimness. He talks about him constantly as a Muslim artist. And I think he can't separate the cultural dimension from the religious dimension. Because quite often, we look at ourselves as a very syncretic culture that where layers of religion, several religions, several cultures kind of synthesize and have made us what we are today. With Roger, he separates it. Apparently, Roger did spend time in Delhi. He taught at the Jame Millia. So he was exposed to South Asian culture. But within this book, there is a great need to put him in a slot, a religious slot. Because there's also another point that emerges in the book is that this book has been written post 9/11, where the whole way of looking at Islam, militancy, violence changed. and Zahoor passed away in 1999. So Roger sometimes confuses the whole thing. He sometimes looks at Zahoor and his life as if he was being persecuted by extremists. Of course there were pressures here. After Ziaul-Haq's time, Pakistan has felt the heavy hand of the extremists, the culture kind of transforming because of certain policies introduced. But I think the way he looks at it, Roger looks at it, it's a totally different lens. So I find that area very problematic. Yes, Aziz has a question. Two questions. Would you like to ask? Please.
Really. Talking about artists,
can you hold it? And please introduce yourself.
I'm Saquib, and a while back you were talking about artists, how they felt about his work. I remember his first exhibition at Chokandi, and there were some small works, very small pieces, about 4 inches by 6 inches, perhaps something like that, and they were in graphite. And I found them extremely sensitive and somehow erotic. And I was very much interested in them. And in fact, I felt like buying one of them. I couldn't perhaps at that time. And I persuaded my Nujan to buy one. And I think somebody, Zala bought one and somebody else. There were 3 or 4 of them. And this is just something which I just wanted to convey to you.
Thank you, Siddiqa Appa. I think there's Zahra in front, and then Aziz.
Hi, I'm curious about the subtitle of the book, Art and Society in Pakistan. And so if you guys could just comment a bit on what the author, what his comment is on art and society in Pakistan.
Saquib, would you like to begin?
Okay, he's very critical of at least the society or the mindset. And as Niilofer was pointing out, he almost gets that to bear on the eventual fate of Zahoor Akhlaq. So it is a very subjective, leaning on negative approach, very colonial in tone and texture. And he really doesn't credit this society with much understanding. And I think that's part of the kind of motivation that he seems to feel, that, he is going to reconstruct Zahoor. But having said that, this is the only book that has been written on Zahoor, so, we may have some questions to ask ourselves about it. Why haven't we said anything about Zahoor? And so in that sense, yes, he is critical. He thinks it lacks depth. It works more on myth. That's what fuels this whole, the art circle and, the society around him. So he does have a very negative approach, almost unpardonably negative. But then he has written a book on Zahoor, which we haven't.
Zohra, would you like to make a comment on that aspect that Zahra asked? How he views society, his comments on society.
Actually, yes, he himself, he thinks he rises above the European prejudice and so on. But he hasn't quite succeeded in doing that. He still has his prejudices and everything, especially the post 9/11. And I think he carries that, how he views the Muslims as generally as they are in the West, though he thinks he doesn't,
Shahana?
I think the choice of subheading of art and society in Pakistan is incredibly telling, because what Roger Connah does not want to look at Zahoor in isolation as an artist or a person. His agenda is to sort of place him in the wider context of society. His entire book consists of remembrances of people within his social and cultural sphere. So I think it sort of gives the reader a clue as to, this is not just about him, but the social and cultural sphere of Pakistan plays a huge role in the book.
This book is divided into books, like sub-books. And the last of it is actually, it has timelines, it has history of, art history with images and, details about artists. It also has a section on writings on Zahoor. So basically, I look at the way he's dividing the book. There is this critical fiction that he talks about and biography, which are the first book 1 and book 2, in which, as I said, fiction and truth sort of fuse kind of seamlessly, and sometimes we can't separate it because he has an agenda. But in the last book, there is this kind of factual documentation that he presents to the reader. So I don't know how deliberate that is, but it's there. That means he is looking at the book as critical fiction and an experiment in biography. And of course, with that, he pushes his own agenda. His own voice is very strong. It is very opinionated. Aziz?
I think it's really interesting because you're talking about this kind of problematic book and this sort of white outsider writing and sort of, criticizing Pakistan and sort of, I guess, playing on the same sort of themes that are persistence, in sort of the West writing about the East, sort of. But it's interesting because I think you mentioned it about just speak about the state of Pakistan itself, that we haven't written a book about Zahoor. And of course, we haven't privileged Zahoor in the same way that we might have privileged Sadiqen and sort of other writers, even though contemporary artists such as Rashid, as you mentioned, really talk about how Zahoor was so important to their current practice and all of that. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that, as if how is this book and sort of going to spur, you think, because we're seeing Archok is going to take Zahoor Akhlaq to Art Dubai, which is going to bring him to sort of an international market, and that's also been a criticism that he hasn't ever been looked at that way internationally. And then State Bank Museum has this sort of big work by Zahoor that they restored. So there is some sort of work happening on Zahoor and some sort of canonization going on around him. So sort of where do you see that heading and that sort of narrative going?
I think Zahoor's presence is very much there in the consciousness of the people. Of course, the state has had a very, small contribution. I think the National Museum in Islamabad does have some of his work. But primarily the estate of Zahoor belongs to his family, which is his wife, Shahrazad, who took most of the work abroad. Some of it is with Hamad Naqvi, Hamad Nasser. Nasser of Green Cardamom, and he has been entrusted to kind of introduce it into the market and build a discourse around it. This is the 15th year of Zahoor's death, and I'm involved in a series of programs throughout the year in which we are looking at Zahoor critically. And that is why I suggested to the KLF that we should begin the year with this program, where we can begin to discuss the only book that has come out on him. And I completely agree with Saquib that I think by the end of this year, and we are working on it, another book should come out which does present Zahoor the way we would like to. Because I think we cannot wrong Roger on this. He was assigned to write a book. He wrote a book the way he wanted to present Zahoor. And now the onus is on us that if we differ with him, we have to take it further. So I think the very fact that Zahoor and his daughter, Noor Jahan, is actually taking care of the estate. It has sort of, in a way, been entrusted to her to, sort of introduce it, through institutional exhibitions or through galleries. So I think a lot will be happening this year because it is 15 years since he died, and that is a hell of a long time. So I think, is there another question?
Amra? My name is Amra Ali. I just
a little louder, Amra.
Wanted to know to what length has Roger gone to contextualize Zahoor's aesthetics, comparing it or contextualizing it within the art practice in which Zahoor was operating within his contemporaries, for example. What are the relationships and conversations he has started, or is he looking at Zahoor through Naqvi and then sort of looking at the aesthetics around Zahoor in the milieu in which Zahoor was emerging, how has he dealt with it, or has he talked about it, the artists, or not?
If I could comment and then I'll invite others to do so. I think he has not done it extensively. Basically, he looks at Zahoor's art in the context of society. He devotes a lot of space to his sculpture and the way he interpreted the crescent. He gets stuck with a lot of symbols, a lot of signifiers. And I think as a critic, he does not in any way go into any depth. As a researcher, his interest seems to lie in the relationships he makes between society and the work, between culture and the work. He does not discuss his peers at length.
In fact, very briefly. I mean, there are certain facets of Zahoor's personality or Zahoor's contribution that don't come out. For instance, his role as a teacher. That's something that is not there. And as Niilofer is pointing out, it's more the interface between society and Zahoor, almost in solitaire. I don't think there is any mention of his contemporaries or what they were doing.
Shahana, did you find?
There are very passing references over and over to how Zahoor amalgamated East and West, tradition, modernity, and how he was so brilliant for doing that and out of his time. But, more than that 2 sentences, he really does not go into the depth to explain how exactly it was different or what the process of Zahoor was or anything of that sort. So in that sense, as a sort of art critique, it's really lacking and you don't get that depth.
But that's also not his intention, as he sets out in the beginning. I mean, this is critical fiction, that's a critical experimental biography, which doesn't necessarily touch on the strains that, sort of form that traditional outlook on an artist or his contribution. The narrative of the book, sort of almost divorces the reader from the other, sort of peripheral elements. It's so much about Zahoor and his direct relation to the society that he is living in, almost an exclusion. I mean, again, it's, part of that, the myth of Zahoor, that he is actually exploring. But not in terms of, where he was, in terms of the art circles or what his relationships were, how he was so different. I mean, none of that is there.
You have another question?
I had a general observation about this book after reading it. I was wondering why the author did not include images of Zahoor Akhlaq's work. I mean, it's one of those few books that you go across and you don't really see images of paintings of the artist. And I just find that the book would have been far more effective had he actually used images of his paintings.
Well, actually, he has Soraya included them, but they remain peripheral. The narrative is the central narrative is different, the core narrative, and they're almost like thumbnails, and they're sort of very condensed in size. So you do not get the sense of them dominating the narrative or being an integral part of it. They always remain on the periphery.
I think this is one of the weaknesses of the book, because when he explains like the inner sanctum or the luminous evidence, there's no photograph, no picture. And the person who has not been initiated to his work, doesn't know his work, he has to refer right to the back. And the photographs are so small, he has to really look through it,
And a lot of it is a black and white book. Basically, this entire book is black and white, and it's got hundreds of tiny images in it. So basically, I think his intentions were very different. He was not looking at Zahoor through the lens of his art. It was predominantly, his death, his life, and then his relationship to society and his peers to some extent.
To some extent, I think it may be deliberate that the paintings are really not there, because they are all documented, catalogued paintings. And, the fact that they're there in minuscule scale, they're almost, as Ms. Niilofer has pointed out, parenthetical to the whole narrative. It's a experimental biography.
I think, today's discussion also is highlighting the fact that one book cannot cover everything. So here is Roger's book that is, presenting us with, a dimension in a particular style, which is random, sort of nebulous. And we who critique this or expect more from a book on Zahoor should really, sort of write ourselves. And I think that's a good note to probably end the session, that the onus now is on writers and critics to take up the challenge. But let me tell you, in the end, it is a book worth reading, because it tells us a considerable amount about the artist and, of course, the times he lived in, the moment of history he occupied. Any questions? Or we can just sort of... I think we have come to the end of our time. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here for this session.
Thank you.